Snow does not fall in Aldern Hollow. It arrives. That was the old saying, and by the time anyone questioned it, the valley was already 3 feet under and closing its doors for the season. Marta Kessler packed moss into her walls in the last week of September, and the valley laughed at her for it. They laughed because moss was what you found in a ditch, not what you built a house from. They laughed because her cabin, set high on the ridge road, was already the smallest structure in Aldern Hollow, and now it looked like a woodpile someone had stuffed with a swamp. "You'll rot before you freeze," said Otho Prince, who ran the feed store and considered himself an authority on most things that grew. Marta didn't answer him. She never answered anyone about the moss. She just kept packing, 14 inches deep between the log courses, working a wooden tamping bat the size of a rolling pin, driving the moss down in 3-inch layers until each layer resisted the bat like a fist. 11 miles down valley, at the low end where the creek widened into marsh before the county road, Josiah Hale was burying barrels. 6 of them, 40 gallons each. Old oak, coopered tight, sunk into pits he'd dug beneath the floor of his cattle barn, 2 feet down, packed round with clay and gravel. "You're drowning your own barn," said his neighbor, a widow named Prue Anlick, watching him work from the fence line with her arms crossed. "I'm warming it," Josiah said. "Water doesn't warm anything. Water freezes. That's the idea." She didn't understand him, and he didn't explain further, because he wasn't sure he could explain it in a way that didn't sound like a man talking to himself. He only knew what was written in the ledger his uncle Caleb Ashworth had left him, 41 years of temperatures and losses, kept in a hand gone crooked with age by the final entries. Water gives up its heat slow when it freezes. Slower than air gives up its heat when it's just cold. A barrel of water freezing over 3 days will keep a barn 10 degrees warmer than the same barn with no barrels at all, for as long as the freezing lasts. Once it's solid ice through, the trick is spent. Refill before it's spent. This is the whole of it. Nobody in this valley has ever believed me, and nobody ever will. Caleb had died 2 winters before Josiah started digging, in a cabin 2 ridges over, alone, with the ledger open on the table and a stub of pencil still in his hand. Marta's grandmother, Ilva Kessler, had died the way old women in the hollow were supposed to die, quietly, in her own bed, in a cabin that never seemed cold no matter how hard the wind came down off the ridge. She left behind a notebook bound in waxed cloth, and in it, in handwriting so small it looked like insect tracks, she had recorded 40 years of failures and 1 long success. Sphagnum moss, dried 6 weeks minimum, packed at 11 pounds to the cubic foot, no less, no more. Less and the wind finds the gaps. More and the moss can't breathe, and a wall that can't breathe holds its damp, and a wall that holds its damp will rot from the inside where you can't see it until the logs go soft. The moss must stay slightly damp, never wet, never bone dry. 18 to 22% moisture by weight. A dry wall is a dead wall. A dry wall gives you no warmth at all. It is the water inside the moss, held in 1,000 small cells, that will not let the cold pass through easily. This is not superstition. This is what my mother taught me and what her mother taught her, and I have measured it with a scale for 40 years to be sure it was true and not merely believed. Marta had inherited the notebook, the cabin, and nothing else. No husband, no cattle, no standing in the valley beyond being the girl who talked to a dead woman's handwriting more than she talked to the living. Her first wall failed in October. She'd packed the north face too fast, at 9 pounds to the cubic foot instead of 11, eager to close it before the first frost. Within 2 weeks, wind found seams in the moss and howled through them at night, thin and high, like a kettle almost boiling. She tore the wall down to the log frame and started again, this time weighing every basket of moss on a hanging scale before she packed it, marking each layer in a ledger of her own, a tally by height, by weight, by hours worked. North wall, course 4, 11.2 lbscf. Course 5, 10.9. Corrected with extra handful, resettled. By November, her ledger had 40 entries and her hands had the permanent ache of a woman twice her age. Josiah's first barrel cracked in November. He'd filled it too near the brim, forgetting that water expands as it freezes, and on the coldest night of the month, the oak split down its seam with a sound like a rifle shot, flooding the barn floor and soaking 3 bales of hay he could not afford to lose. Prue Amlick heard the crack from her porch and came over with a lantern, expecting to find him crushed under a beam. Instead, she found him on his knees in half-frozen mud, laughing without any humor in it at all. "Leave 2 inches of air at the top," he muttered, mostly to himself, mostly to the ledger in his head. Caleb wrote it plain as day, and I still filled it to the lip. He refilled the barrel to 38 gallons instead of 40. He did not make that mistake again. By December, the whole valley had an opinion about both of them, and the opinions had merged into a single joke that made its way around the general store, that the Ridge Road had gone soft in the head, packing swamp into her walls, and the low end had gone soft in the head, drowning his own cattle for warmth, and between the two of them Aldern Hollow had lost its senses at both elevations at once. Marta heard about Josiah's barrels from Otho Prince, who told it like a punchline. "Man's got water buried under his barn like he's growing it," Otho said. "Same as you and your ditch weeds. Reckon the 2 of you ought to marry your foolishness and save the rest of us the laughing." Marta didn't laugh either. She thought, privately, that burying water where it could only freeze and crack seemed like a poorer idea than her own, and said so, once, when she passed Josiah on the county road with a wagon of dried moss stacked higher than her head. "Water in a barn in winter," she said. "Bold thing to trust." "Bolder than trusting a wall made of ditch scrapings," Josiah answered, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Neither one smiled. The horse pulling Marta's wagon, a dun mare named Clove, sidestepped and would not settle near Josiah's dog, a rangy black and tan named Finn, who stood in the road with his ears flat and would not come when called, staring instead at the moss piled in the wagon bed as though it had personally offended him. They went their separate ways without another word, each certain the other was a fool, each unaware that within 6 weeks their 2 foolish things would be the only reason half the valley survived January. The old road warden of Aldern Hollow was a man named Osric Vane, and he had held the position for 19 years because he was the only man in the valley willing to do the arithmetic of water rights without complaint. He controlled the Leet, the narrow diversion channel that carried spring water down from the high ground, past Marta's Ridge, past a dozen smaller farms, down to the marsh where Josiah's barn stood. He decided who could draw from it, and when, and how much. In November, Marta had asked him for permission to cut a drainage flume across the shared right-of-way below her cabin, to carry snowmelt away from her foundation before it could pool and freeze and heave the logs apart from underneath. Osric had refused her. "That water belongs to the low farms in a dry summer," he said. "I won't have you digging trenches across common ground on a hunch about your moss walls." In the same week, Josiah had asked him to widen his draw from the Leet, to keep a trickle running to his barrels through the coldest months so the barrels could be refilled before freezing solid and losing their use. Osric had refused him too. "Every farm in this valley wants more water in winter and less accounting for it," he said. "I'll not open the Leet wider for a man drowning his own cattle shed." He doubted them exactly the same amount, which was a great deal, and he told anyone who asked that the Ridge Road and the Low End had produced, in the same season, the 2 most wasteful uses of good materials he'd seen in 19 years of watching the valley waste things. Marta cut her flume anyway, narrow and shallow, just inside her own property line, calculating the grade with a spirit level borrowed from the church and a patience Otho Prince found faintly insulting to watch. Josiah kept his barrels topped by hauling water in buckets from the creek by hand, twice a day, when the Leet wouldn't be given to him. Neither told the other what they were doing. Neither had reason to. They were not yet allies. They were only 2 people the valley had decided, independently, to mock. The quiet one stood by them regardless. For Marta, it was a boy named Peel, 11 years old, orphaned onto his aunt's farm 2 summers before, who came by most afternoons to help haul dried moss, because he liked the smell of it drying in the loft, green and mineral, and because Marta never told him to hush the way his aunt did. "They say you're building a swamp," Peel told her once, hauling a basket nearly as big as himself. "Let them," Marta said. "A swamp doesn't freeze through. That's the whole point of it." For Josiah, it was Prue Amlick, who had stopped laughing sometime in November without quite admitting it, and now brought him coffee at dusk when he came in from hauling creek water, and stood watching the barrels with an expression that had gone from amusement to something more careful. "If this works," she said one evening, "I'll never hear the end of it from you. If it doesn't, Josiah said. You won't have to. The dogfin would not enter the barn on the night the last barrel was set and sealed. He stood in the doorway with his hackles up, whining low at the ground where the buried oak sat under 2 feet of packed clay, as though something beneath the floor had a heartbeat he didn't trust. It took 3 weeks before he'd crossed the threshold without being dragged, and even then he slept as far from the barrel pits as the barn allowed. The mare clove would not settle near Marta's north wall either, not until the moss had cured a full month and the wall had stopped smelling of wet earth and started smelling only faintly of green things sleeping. After that she leaned into it in the cold, the way animals lean into warmth they can't explain and don't need to. Both animals, in their own ways, were reading something the humans hadn't yet agreed to believe. The first hard warning came on the 18th of December, when the sky over the ridge turned the color of a bruise and stayed that way for 2 full days without releasing a single flake. Osric Vane rode the length of the valley checking woodpiles and livestock counts, as he did before every serious storm, and found both Marta's cabin and Josiah's barn in states he didn't have a name for yet. Wall's not finished, he said to Marta, eyeing the last 4 feet of exposed log on her south face. It will be by tomorrow night. Storm won't wait on your schedule. Storms don't, Marta agreed, and kept tamping. At the low end, he found Josiah checking the level in each barrel with a stick marked in inches, murmuring numbers to himself that Osric didn't understand and didn't ask about. You're going to flood this barn and lose the herd to wet cold instead of dry cold, Osric told him. There's no difference in the dying. There's a difference in the 10 hours before the dying, Josiah said. That's the only thing I'm buying. 10 hours, maybe 12. Osric rode back to his own farm that evening more troubled than he let on, not because he believed either of them, but because for the first time in the season, neither of them had argued back with him. They had simply kept working, as though his doubt was weather too, and weather didn't change what needed doing. The storm came down off the ridge on the 21st of December, 2 hours before dawn, and it did not announce itself the way storms usually did in Aldern Hollow, with a rising wind and a slow graying of the sky. It simply arrived, all at once, temperature dropping 19 degrees in under an hour, snow driving sideways thick enough to erase the tree line, and by first light the whole valley had gone the flat white gray of a held breath. By midday the thermometer nailed outside the general store read 31 below and still falling. By evening, the lead had frozen solid at its narrowest point below the ridge, the same narrow point Osric had always guarded so carefully, and the water simply stopped moving. At the low end, Josiah's barrels began to freeze in earnest around noon, ice creeping inward from the staves, releasing their stored heat slowly into the barn air exactly as Caleb's ledger had promised. For 11 hours it worked exactly as written. The barn held at 18 degrees above zero while the world outside sat at 30 below, and the cattle stood close together and did not shiver the way cattle shivered in a barn with no such buffer. But by the 12th hour, disaster arrived on schedule, in a way the ledger had also warned of and Josiah had simply run out of time to prevent. The barrels were freezing solid, not slushing, not still releasing heat as they froze, solid, through and through, their trick spent, exactly as Caleb had written 40 years before. Refill before it's spent. And there was no water left to refill them with, because the lead above had frozen shut, and the creek itself was locking over inch by inch, and the buckets Josiah had hauled twice daily for 2 months were now useless against a channel sealed in ice a foot thick. They're done, he said to Prue, who had come through the storm on foot rather than leave him alone in it, both of them standing in a barn that was beginning, degree by degree, to lose the only edge it had bought. Solid through. No more heat coming off them. We've got maybe 3 hours before this barn is the same temperature as the yard. Then we need the lead open, Prue said. Osric will never open it in a storm like this. Man barely opened it in good weather. Then someone else needs to open it. 2 miles up the ridge, Marta's south wall, the last one finished, the newest, the least cured, was doing something her grandmother's notebook had warned her about only once, in a single crooked line near the back of the book that Marta had read a dozen times without understanding until that hour. A new wall in a hard freeze will sweat before it settles. Watch for ice forming on the inner face. This is the moss releasing water faster than the cold can use it. If ice forms inside, the wall is drowning, not warming. You must vent it or lose it. Ice was forming on the inner face. A thin glaze, at first, along the base of the south wall, then thickening by the hour into something that caught lamplight like a pane of glass laid sideways. Marta pressed a bare hand against it and felt cold radiating through instead of held back, the opposite of everything the wall was meant to do. She understood, with the flat, clear terror of someone reading their own mistake in real time, what was happening. The wall had been packed too recently, too wet, and now the moisture inside it was being driven inward by the extreme outside cold faster than it could be absorbed or evaporated, and it was freezing solid against the inner log face, turning her breathing wall into a block of ice with no give left in it at all. Behind her, the fire in the hearth burned hard and did almost nothing against a wall now working like a slab of stone instead of a living, breathing thing. If the whole wall went the same way, the cabin would lose its heat as fast as any thin-boarded shack in the valley, faster, because the ice would then conduct the cold straight through where the moss had once slowed it. She needed the wall to breathe again. She needed airflow behind the logs, moving air to carry the excess moisture back out before it froze in place. And the only channel built for exactly that kind of drainage was the shallow flume she'd cut months before, along the base of the wall, meant for meltwater in spring, sitting bone-dry and useless in a hard freeze because there was no water moving through it at all to carry warmth or draw the damp out with it. Peel arrived at her door at that exact hour, half-frozen himself, having walked the ridge road on his aunt's orders to check on her, and found Marta staring at her own wall like it was an enemy. "It's drowning," she said, more to herself than to him. "Same as Josiah said his barn would drown." I laughed at the man, and he had the right word for it the whole time. "What do you need?" "Moving water." "Along the flume. Enough to carry the freeze out before it locks the whole wall solid." "There's no water moving anywhere tonight," Peel said. "The whole leets ice." The two facts met in the storm the way two rivers meet, without ceremony, without anyone planning it, simply because the land and the need were shaped for it. Osric Vane rode the ridge road that night not out of duty, but out of the same restless dread that had sent him checking woodpiles before every storm for 19 years. And he found Peel running down the road toward the low end at a speed that told him something was badly wrong before the boy said a single word. "Josiah needs the leet open," Peel gasped. "And Marta needs it too. Her wall's freezing solid from the inside. She needs water moving through her flume same as he needs it in his barrels. The lead is frozen at the narrows," Osric said. "There is no opening it with words." "Then open it with something else." Osric looked at the boy and past him at the ridge and did the arithmetic he had spent 19 years refusing to abandon even in a crisis. If the lead opened at the narrows, gravity would carry it first past Marta's flume, then on down the full length of the valley to the marsh, where Josiah's barrels sat empty and freezing solid. One channel, two desperate uses. The same water, wanted at both ends, by two people who had spent the whole autumn convinced the other was a fool. He turned his horse without another word and rode for the narrows with a pick and a maul lashed to his saddle. The same tools he'd have used to clear a downed tree, because it was the only tool he had for ice a foot thick, and because for the first time in 19 years of guarding that channel from waste, he understood there was a worse waste than giving the water away. He swung the pick himself, in the dark, in 31 below, until his shoulders burned and the ice gave way in a long, cracking seam, and the leet groaned and shuddered and began, slowly, to move again. That single act, an old skeptic breaking ice with his own hands in the freezing dark, for two people he had refused all autumn, was the only conversion the story needed, and it happened without a word of apology from anyone. The water reached Marta's flume first. It was thin, barely a hand's width deep, but it was moving, and moving water carries heat that standing water does not. And within the hour the ice glazing the inner face of her south wall had begun, reluctantly, to weep instead of harden, the moss behind the logs finally able to shed its excess damp into the flume instead of locking it in place. By the second hour, the wall had stopped sweating ice and started, once again, to simply hold warmth the way it had every night since November. The same water ran on, downhill, gathering speed on the grade Marta had leveled with a borrowed church tool months before anyone thought to thank her for it, and reached the low end of the valley 2 hours after that, filling the creek enough for Josiah and Prue to break through the surface ice with an axe and haul water by the bucketful once more, refilling the frozen barrels exactly as Caleb's ledger had always said to. Refill before it's spent. They refilled it after it was spent, which the ledger had not accounted for. But the barrels took the new water and began the slow work of freezing again, releasing heat again, buying the barn another 11 hours it would not otherwise have had. 11 hours that carried the herd through the coldest stretch of the night and into a morning where the temperature climbed, at last, back above zero. Neither Marta nor Josiah knew, in the hours it was happening, that the same channel of water was saving them both. Marta only knew her wall had stopped weeping ice. Josiah only knew the creek had, against all reason, given him water in the worst freeze of his life. They learned the shape of it only after, standing in the gray light of the morning after the storm broke, at the narrows where Osric Vane still sat on a stump beside his horse, hands split and bleeding from the pick, too tired to have ridden home. Marta reached the narrows first, on foot, having walked the 2 miles down from the ridge the moment the wind allowed it. Josiah arrived not long after, on a horse gone gray with frost, both of them drawn to the same place by the same instinct to see where the water had actually come from. They stood on opposite sides of the broken ice and looked at each other for a long moment without speaking, the way people look at each other when the ground beneath an old certainty has quietly given way overnight. Finn crossed to Marta's side of the channel without being called and did not growl, and stood pressed against her leg watching the water instead of the barn behind him for the first time all winter. Clove, tied loosely to a fence post nearby, put her nose down and drank from the running lead, without any hesitation at all. Osric didn't rise from the stump. He only looked up at the two of them and said nothing, which from a man who had spent 19 years saying a great deal, was its own kind of confession. Marta spoke first, because someone had to, and there was no room left in her for pride about it. "Your barrels held it," she said, "longer than I thought water could." Josiah looked at the water running clean and fast between them, carrying the same cold that had nearly killed them both, now doing the opposite work entirely. "Your ditch fed my barrels," he said. "I never once thought to thank a trench for anything. That was the whole of it. No embrace, no long reckoning. Just two people who had spent a season doubting each other, exchanging a dozen words apiece over running water, and meaning every one of them. The valley did not throw a celebration. Valleys like Aldern Hollow rarely did, and the winter was not yet finished with them regardless of what one storm had settled. But by spring, Otho Prince had stopped telling the joke about the ditch and the drowned cattle, and Osric Vane had widened the Leets' winter allowance without being asked twice, and Peel had started keeping his own small notebook of moss weights in a hand that was trying very hard to imitate Marta's. Ilva Kessler's notebook and Caleb Ashworth's ledger sat, from that year forward, on the same shelf in the valley's meeting hall, side by side, two different handwritings recording the same stubborn truth from two different corners of the same cold country. It was not a truth either dead mentor had ever spoken aloud to the other, and neither living pupil had ever meant to prove it together. But the valley came, in time, to say it anyway, the way valleys keep the sayings that survive their storms. What looks like waste to a dry season is often what a hard one is waiting for.